Medieval society had some disturbingly harsh ways of dealing with overweight people, and the double standard behind it is darker than most realize. Imagine living in a world where a round belly was not shameful, but a public badge of success. In medieval Europe, your waistline practically announced your social standing to everyone who saw you. Most common folk in those days were thin, but not by choice. Their lives were endless cycles of hard physical labor, hauling grain, tending crops, and doing exhausting tasks that would make modern fitness routines look like child's play. Their meals were plain and repetitive, mostly bread, gruel, and the occasional handful of vegetables. Meat was a luxury reserved for weddings, funerals, or festival days. But climb the social ladder, and the entire menu changed. The rich dined like royalty every day. Roasted meats, sweet pastries, endless jugs of wine, and buttery dishes graced their tables. When you could afford such indulgence, your body showed it. The wealthier you were, the rounder you became. Medieval writers could not get enough of describing large rulers, bulky monks, and wealthy merchants whose stomachs arrived before the rest of them. Some accounts even joked about nobles needing help to mount their horses, or priests whose robes could barely contain them. But weight in that era was not just about food. It was a loud, visible signal of privilege. Being heavy meant you did not have to work with your hands. While peasants burned every calorie in the fields, nobles feasted and relaxed while servants handled the toil. A thin nobleman raised eyebrows. Was he sick? Had his fortune failed? Meanwhile, a fat peasant was practically unheard of. It made for some ironic situations. Imagine being so rich that your biggest hardship was finding clothes that fit, while most of the population prayed simply to eat. True luxury problems, medieval style. Writers of the time loved to point out these extremes. They described kings needing custom armor, bishops requiring 2 horses to ride, and lords gasping for air after climbing a single staircase. Body size in medieval Europe was more than physical, it was symbolic. The poor were lean because they had no choice, and the rich were plump because they could afford to be. Simple as that. But while society admired visible wealth, the church viewed all that feasting through a very different lens. The medieval church had a serious issue with overeating, and it made its opinion official. Gluttony was listed as one of the 7 deadly sins, right alongside greed, envy, and pride. That was not a list anyone wanted to appear on. Preachers warned that eating too much was a sign of spiritual weakness. They believed the state of your soul to be read in your stomach. Monks lectured each other about the dangers of indulgence, even as they eyed the monastery pantry. But the church's obsession with food had little to do with health. It was all about moral control. Indulgence was portrayed as dangerous because it symbolized a lack of self-discipline. If you could not stop at 1 extra serving of stew, how could you resist greater sins? Moral tales from the period hammered this message home. Fat characters were written as lazy, greedy, or corrupt. These stories left no room for subtlety. The fatter the figure, the blacker the soul. On the other hand, fasting became the ultimate proof of holiness. The thinner and weaker one appeared, the more virtuous they seemed. Some saints became famous specifically for their extreme self-denial, praised for surviving on almost no food at all. It is hard not to compare that to modern culture's obsession with dieting. Yet, in an ironic twist, many high-ranking clergymen who preached against gluttony were far from thin. Monastery kitchens served hearty meals, and wealthy bishops dined better than most kings. While they scolded others for indulgence, they enjoyed rich dishes and fine wine in private. Confession manuals even included detailed questions about how people ate. Priests were told to ask whether parishioners had overeaten, enjoyed expensive foods, or taken too much pleasure in their meals. Apparently, even smiling at your supper could raise suspicion about your soul. The church also enforced strict fasting rules. Wednesdays, Fridays, and the entire season of Lent meant everyone was expected to restrict eating, often under threat of punishment. Breaking those rules could lead to serious consequences. Religious art from the time made the message even clearer. Gluttony was painted as grotesque a sin, represented by bloated figures surrounded by food. Holy figures, in contrast, were thin, pale, and otherworldly, free from earthly hunger. The influence of these teachings spread far beyond monasteries. The Church's moral authority shaped how society judged body size for generations. When religious leaders declared fatness sinful, it changed how people viewed the wealthy and the poor alike. It touched everything from who was considered virtuous to who was deemed worthy of marriage or respect. In the end, medieval Europe's view of weight was a strange mix of admiration and condemnation. The rich wore their size like a crown, but the Church turned that same image into a symbol of sin. It was a contradiction that revealed just how deeply food, faith, and power were intertwined in the medieval world. Of course, medieval medicine had its own strange yet fascinating ideas about body size and what caused it. Physicians of that time were not exactly up to date with modern science. They leaned heavily on ancient Greek and Roman writings, treating those old works like divine truth. The theories of Galen, a doctor from the 2nd century, were still considered the ultimate authority nearly 1,000 years later. It was like a career that kept paying long after the man himself was gone. These early physicians believed the human body was governed by a fragile harmony of 4 fluids called humors. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile controlled everything from your mood to your weight. Being a little plump was not necessarily seen as a bad sign. In fact, it often meant you had plenty to eat and were in good health. The real danger, according to them, came when someone grew what they described as dangerously corpulent. That is where things got interesting. Medical manuals warned that extreme fatness could shorten a person's life. They were not entirely wrong, but their proposed cures would make any modern doctor cringe. Treatment usually began with gentle advice: eat less meat and more vegetables. Exercise was recommended, though convincing a noble to break a sweat was easier said than done. Herbal medicine was also common, with fennel and other plants used to help digestion, or supposedly melt away excess fat. But then the recommendations took a darker turn. Some doctors prescribed vomiting on purpose. Others encouraged heavy use of laxatives as a form of weight control. Imagine having to explain that at your next medical appointment. All of this stemmed from their belief in those 4 humors. Too much hot and moist humor, they said, caused the body to swell. Purging was supposed to restore balance. It sounds logical only if you ignore actual biology. Physicians even classified different types of obesity, offering separate treatments depending on whether someone was soft and loose or firm and solid. They noticed differences between body types, even if their reasons for those differences made no sense. Only the rich could afford such medical experiments. The poor rarely needed them anyway, since their diets left little room for gaining weight. When they did have health problems, peasants turned to home remedies or simply endured it. Still, medieval doctors were surprisingly forward-thinking in one way. They saw obesity as a medical issue, not just a personal flaw. They viewed it as something needing treatment, even if their cures were questionable at best. Yet body image in medieval society was never just about health. It was about reputation, identity, and social class. Physical appearance mattered deeply. Peasants valued being lean because it showed they worked hard. Muscular, sunburned bodies were badges of honest labor. But among nobles, the story was far more complicated. Being slightly round might suggest prosperity, but growing too fat could destroy your dignity. People whispered behind the backs of overweight nobles, calling them lazy and weak. Court musicians and jesters mocked them mercilessly, turning their size into punchlines. Stories and songs poked fun at rulers who could not mount their horses or had to squeeze into their chairs. It was the medieval version of public shaming. One of the most famous examples was King Sancho of Leon, remembered forever as Sancho the Fat. He became so large that his own nobles deposed him, claiming he was unfit to rule. To regain his throne, he had to undergo a strict medieval diet. It is almost unbelievable, a king forced to lose weight to keep his crown. This was not only about appearance. People truly believed that being overweight affected judgment and character. A heavy ruler was thought to be lazy, slow, and ruled by desire. If a man could not control his appetite, how could he control a kingdom? It sounds harsh, but it reflected genuine beliefs about leadership and morality. The ridicule was constant. Nobles who put on weight became the butt of jokes at feasts. Servants gossiped about them. Rival lords spread rumors, and visiting ambassadors took note. Political enemies used their size to question their strength and fitness to rule. It was the great irony of noble life. The same luxury that gave the upper class their lavish meals also set them up for humiliation. Fine food and rich drink were privileges, but too much of either could strip away respect and power. And the challenges did not stop at reputation. There were very real physical struggles that came with being overweight in a world built for smaller people. Medieval buildings were not designed for comfort. Doorways were low and narrow, staircases steep and uneven, and furniture small. Moving through a castle or church could feel like navigating an obstacle course. Armor and clothing were tailored tightly, and horses had weight limits that even nobles could not ignore. So for the wealthy, carrying extra weight was not just a symbol of success, it was a daily inconvenience. Every step, every climb, every public appearance reminded them that their privilege came with its own very literal burdens. In a society obsessed with appearances, the body became both a measure of fortune and a trap of its own making. If you were a heavy nobleman trying to squeeze through your own castle doorway, things could get awkward fast. Chairs were another daily struggle. Medieval furniture was never designed for comfort, but if you carried a few extra pounds, sitting down could turn into an unintentional comedy show. Wooden chairs groaned under pressure. Stone benches offered no comfort at all. And trying to climb onto a horse after one too many feasts was an ordeal best left unseen. Then came the clothing issue. Luckily for the wealthy, they could pay for custom-made garments. Armor had to be specially forged for larger knights, which cost a fortune and took ages to complete. Poor people did not have that luxury. They had to make do with whatever scraps of fabric they could stretch around their bodies. Yet public reactions were not always cruel. People noticed when someone was unusually large, of course, but outright ridicule was rare. Most medieval folks had greater worries, like disease, hunger, or crushing taxes. Still, festivals were a different story altogether. During local celebrations, performers often mocked gluttony and excess eating. Fat characters became stock figures representing greed or sin, giving the poor and hungry audience a chance to laugh at the upper class. The bitter irony of that was not lost on anyone. Common laborers could hardly gain weight even if they wanted to. Their exhausting work burned every bit of food they ate. Obesity was a privilege reserved for the wealthy, which made it both a sign of success and a reason for resentment. Privacy was another problem. Medieval life happened in public. Everyone could see how much you ate, how you moved, and how often you struggled with daily tasks. Gossip traveled faster than any official news. Being the subject of chatter could be embarrassing. Everyday life presented countless challenges, from fitting through narrow market lanes to finding clothes that did not rip apart. Yet the issue went beyond practical troubles. Body size carried different meanings depending on class, gender, and beauty standards. King Sancho I of Leon learned that the hard way. He became known throughout Europe as Sancho the Fat, and it was not a friendly nickname. He grew so large that his own nobles decided they could no longer serve a king who needed help just to mount a horse. In 958, they removed him from the throne. Imagine losing your crown because you could not resist the medieval version of sweet pastries. But Sanko did not give up. He traveled all the way to Cordoba to seek help from Hasdai ibn Shaprit, one of the most respected physicians of his age. This man was a medical genius by the standards of the 10th century. His cure, however, was brutal. Ibn Shaprat reportedly confined Sanko to a room and forced him onto a strict starvation diet. Some records even claim that his lips were partly sewn shut to stop him from overeating. Compared to that, modern weight loss treatments sound almost pleasant. Other stories tell of abbots and bishops who preached against gluttony while struggling with it themselves. One monk became so large that his church chair had to be reinforced to hold his weight. The hypocrisy was impossible to miss. Medieval medicine offered a variety of bizarre solutions. Some doctors advised long hours of sleep or intense massages to push out the fat. Others demanded months of herbal diets with nothing but water to drink. A few recommended rolling patients down hills or shaking them after meals to help digestion. Across Europe, desperate nobles sought every strange cure available. One French count employed servants whose only duty was to stop him from eating outside of mealtimes. Another dismissed his entire kitchen staff, believing they were secretly feeding him extra portions. The most extreme example was a German lord whose castle had to be altered to fit his size. Workers widened doors, strengthened floors, and built custom furniture. When he died, they even removed part of a wall to carry out his body for burial. These stories sound absurd today, but they were genuine attempts to cope with serious health issues in an age of limited understanding. Still, perceptions of weight depended on gender as much as class. Men and women faced entirely different standards. Medieval beauty ideals were as confusing as trying to read a book written backward. What was considered attractive for a man or a woman shifted with time and region. For noble women, being slightly rounded was often seen as healthy and desirable. It suggested fertility, wealth, and good living. After all, a woman who looked too thin might seem poor or ill. Yet there was a fine line. The ideal was soft curves, not true obesity. Rich ladies had access to plenty of food, but were expected to keep their figures balanced. Too thin looked unhealthy. Too fat looked greedy. And in a society obsessed with appearances and moral virtue, both could be dangerous in their own way. Too large and you risked being labeled greedy, which carried its own troubles. Medieval poets sometimes praised fuller shapes, describing women with rounded arms and soft cheeks as lovely. But no poet was writing romantic odes about truly overweight women. Then there were the men. They had it far worse. A heavy nobleman was an easy target for gossip and ridicule. His bulk suggested laziness, indulgence, and lack of control. People whispered that if he could not manage his appetite, how could he possibly manage his estate? The irony was cruel. Poor women, on the other hand, rarely dealt with such issues because gaining weight was nearly impossible. Hard physical labor and small food rations kept most peasant women thin, whether they liked it or not. The entire question of beauty standards was, quite literally, a problem of the rich. Medieval stories revealed these contradictions in vivid ways. Some tales praised curvy heroines, while others mocked large bodies as ridiculous. Historical accounts show that women's obesity was usually seen as a strange medical condition rather than a moral weakness. Men were judged far more harshly. A plump merchant's wife might be described as fortunate and healthy, while a plump merchant himself was seen as gluttonous and greedy. The difference in treatment was clear as day. Women had more freedom to appear well-fed, but only up to a narrow point. What counted as attractive changed with time. Fashion, religion, and politics all influenced how people viewed the human body. What was charming one year might be condemned the next. But beneath those shifting trends, something much darker was going on inside towns and castles. There were the extreme examples, the ones that pushed medicine and morality to their limits. And this is where things turned cruel. Medieval culture did not just look down on fat people. It turned their struggles into public amusement. Imagine the town square on a busy market day. Performers waddled around with stuffed bellies, pretending to be greedy nobles unable to move through doors. The crowd laughed as the fake gluttons tricked and stumbled. It was entertainment built on humiliation. Mystery plays, which told religious stories, often portrayed gluttony as a living character. This figure usually staggered across the stage, stuffing food into his mouth until punished by divine justice. Children giggled while adults nodded, convinced they were witnessing a moral lesson. Feast days could be even stranger. Some towns held eating contests to see who could consume the most, only to shame the winners for gluttony afterward. The contradiction was stunning. They celebrated overeating and condemned it in the same breath. And then came the public punishments. When a priest or monk became noticeably overweight, church leaders sometimes made them confess their sin before everyone. The poor man would stand trembling before the congregation as people whispered about his size. The ritual was meant to humble him, but it was pure cruelty disguised as faith. The justification? People believed that public humiliation would cleanse the sinner's soul. They thought shame could cure gluttony. It was the medieval version of a weight loss program, except with far more emotional suffering. Street entertainers cashed in on the trend too. Wandering minstrels sang mocking songs about fat kings and nobles. One ballad told of a ruler so large that his horse groaned beneath him. Another joked about a lord whose belly arrived at a banquet before he did. During carnival season, revelers dressed in padded costumes and paraded through the streets, pretending to gorge on food before Lent began. It looked like comedy, but the message was vicious. Even children took part. Parents encouraged them to laugh at heavy adults, teaching that certain bodies deserve mockery. Cruelty became tradition, passed from one generation to the next. This obsession with ridicule revealed something deeply unsettling about medieval society. It was not enough to judge or pity those who were different. People needed to watch them suffer. The laughter was not innocent. It was a form of punishment, and the entire community took part.